Welcome to the Honeyed Leaf, where every cup of tea comes with a story. I'm so glad you're here. If you enjoy gentle mysteries that help you sleep, please subscribe so you never miss a visit to Willowbrook. Tonight, we're returning to the peaceful village, where Clara Whitmore is about to find herself drawn into another gentle mystery. Before we begin, find a comfortable position, close your eyes if you'd like, and let yourself relax. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Just let the story carry you peacefully towards sleep. Now, let's visit Willowbrook together. Chapter 1. An unexpected visitor. The October rain fell softly on Willowbrook, creating a gentle percussion against the windows of the Honeyed Leaf. Clara Whitmore stood behind her counter, watching the drops trace their way down the glass, each one following its own meandering path to the windowsill below. It was the kind of rain that made everything feel cosy, the kind that made you grateful to be inside, warm and dry, with a cup of something hot in your hands. Clara had lit the fire early this morning, and Marmalade had claimed his spot on the velvet cushion almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting all summer for this moment. The shop smelled of cinnamon and apple today. Clara had been experimenting with an autumn blend, combining her usual chamomile base with dried apple pieces, a touch of cinnamon bark, and a hint of clove. The result was comforting and seasonal, perfect for the grey October days that had settled over the village. Mrs. Pembroke arrived at 9:15, exactly as expected, shaking out her umbrella in the doorway. "Dreadful weather," she announced, though her tone suggested she rather enjoyed it. "But perfect for tea." "Earl Grey?" Clara asked, already reaching for the tin. "Please, dear. And perhaps one of those apple scones I smell." Clara had indeed baked apple scones that morning, studded with bits of dried apple and topped with a light glaze. She plated 2 for Mrs. Pembroke and brought everything to her usual table by the window. "How is Eleanor's garden holding up in all this rain?" Mrs. Pembroke asked as Clara set down the tea service. It had been 3 months since the Garden Society tea, where they'd unveiled the Hartwell Garden blend, and Eleanor had become a regular topic of village conversation. The successful revival of her family tradition had made her something of a local celebrity, though Eleanor herself remained as modest as ever. "I haven't been by in a few days," Clara admitted. "But knowing Eleanor, everything is perfectly managed. She's probably already put the garden to bed for winter." Such a remarkable woman, and that niece of hers, Sophie, I hear she's extended her stay indefinitely." "She has. She's working at the library with Beatrice now." "How lovely. Young people staying in the village instead of running off to the cities. We need more of that." The morning continued in its pleasant rhythm. The rain kept falling, creating a soothing backdrop to the quiet conversations and the clink of teacups. Mr. Chen came in, shaking water from his jacket, settling in with his green tea and the morning paper. Old Tom Fletcher appeared, grumbling good-naturedly about the weather, ordering his usual strong builder's tea. Around 11, during a lull, Clara was restocking her tea tins when the bell chimed. She looked up to see a woman she didn't recognise standing in the doorway, dripping water despite the umbrella she carried. The woman was perhaps in her early 60s, tall and thin, with grey hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a waxed jacket and Wellington boots, clearly dressed for the weather, and carried a large canvas bag over one shoulder. "Good morning." Clara greeted her warmly. "Come in out of the rain. Can I get you something hot?" "That would be wonderful, thank you." The woman's voice was educated, with a hint of a Yorkshire accent. She set down her umbrella and bag, looking around the shop with evident approval. "What a charming place. I've been walking past for weeks, telling myself I should stop in." "I'm glad you finally did. I'm Clara Whitmore. Margaret Thornbury. Dr. Margaret Thornbury, technically, though I'm retired now." She smiled. "Just moved to Willowbrook about 6 weeks ago. Bought Ivy Cottage, down by the stream." Clara knew the cottage. It had been empty for nearly a year after old Mrs. Henderson had passed away. It was a lovely stone cottage, small but beautifully situated, with a large garden that backed onto the stream that ran through the village. "Welcome to Willowbrook," Clara said sincerely. "What can I get you? Something warming, I think, on a day like this." "What would you recommend?" Clara considered. The woman had a practical, no-nonsense air about her, but there was also something gentle in her manner. "My autumn blend," she decided. Apple, cinnamon and chamomile. Comforting without being too sweet. That sounds perfect. As Clara prepared the tea, Margaret settled at a table near the fire. Marmalade, ever the opportunist when it came to potential admirers, sauntered over to investigate. Margaret reached down to scratch behind his ears, and he purred his approval. "Beautiful cat," Margaret said when Clara brought over the tea and a scone. "My own cat is still settling in at the cottage. She's been rather put out by the move." "Moving is stressful for cats," Clara agreed, sitting down for a moment. The shop was quiet, with only Mr. Chen absorbed in his paper at the other end of the room. "What brings you to Willowbrook, if you don't mind my asking?" "Retirement, mainly. I spent 35 years teaching botany at the University of Leeds. When I retired last year, I realised I'd spent my entire career in cities and laboratories. I wanted somewhere green and quiet for the next chapter." Margaret sipped her tea and smiled. "This is excellent, by the way." "Thank you. And you chose well. Willowbrook is certainly green and quiet. So I'm discovering. Everyone has been wonderfully welcoming. Your librarian, Beatrice Morgan, has been particularly helpful. She's been introducing me around, helping me get oriented." "That's very like Beatrice." "She mentioned something interesting when I told her about my background in botany. Said there's a woman here, Eleanor Hartwell, who has an exceptional garden and recently revived some family herbal traditions." Clara felt a flutter of interest. "Yes, Eleanor's garden is magnificent, and the herbal traditions. I was actually involved in helping rediscover those. We found an old family recipe book that had been lost for decades." Margaret's eyes lit up. "How fascinating. Beatrice said you might tell me the story if I stopped by." So Clara told her. About finding Agnes Hartwell's journal at the library, about the search for the lost garden book, about recreating the garden blend and serving it at the Garden Society tea. Margaret listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested, asking occasional questions that showed her botanical expertise. "What I wouldn't give to examine that garden book," Margaret said when Clara had finished. "From a botanical history perspective, it sounds invaluable. These old family records often contain knowledge that was never formally documented." "It's on display at the library now, properly conserved. Beatrice would be happy to show it to you, I'm sure. I'll definitely stop by." Margaret paused, then added, "Actually, that's partly why I wanted to talk to you. Beatrice mentioned you have an interest in herbs and historical remedies." "I do. It's central to my work here, really. Understanding the properties of different plants, how they combine, what they're traditionally used for." Margaret nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. "Then perhaps you can help me with something. A small mystery, you might say." Clara felt that familiar flutter of curiosity. "I'd be happy to try." Margaret reached for her canvas bag and pulled out an old book. It was roughly the size of a paperback novel, bound in faded green cloth that might once have been a brighter shade. The cover was worn smooth in places, and the corners were bumped and frayed. "This belonged to my grandmother," Margaret said, handling it carefully. "She was a keen gardener, grew most of her own food, kept extensive herb beds. She died when I was 12, and my mother kept this book, passed it down to me when I expressed interest in botany." She opened the book to show Clara. The pages were filled with handwriting in faded brown ink, lists of plants, sketches of leaves and flowers, notes about planting times and growing conditions. "It's her garden journal," Margaret explained. "She kept it for decades, recording everything about her garden. What she planted, when she planted it, what worked and what didn't, recipes for using the harvest, remedies she made from various herbs." "It's beautiful," Clara said, carefully turning a few pages. The handwriting was neat and precise, the sketches surprisingly skilled. "It was one of my treasures growing up," Margaret said softly. "After Grandmother died, I used to pore over this journal, learning about the plants she'd grown. It's part of what drew me to botany in the first place." What a lovely connection to her. "Yes." Margaret's expression grew troubled. "But here's the problem. About 15 years ago, my mother told me there was actually a second journal. Grandmother had kept 2 volumes. The first one, this one, covered roughly 1920 to 1945. The second was supposed to cover 1945 until her death in 1968. Clara looked up. "Supposed to?" My mother said Grandmother had shown her both journals, talked about leaving them both to me since I was the one who'd inherited her love of gardening. But when Grandmother died, the family only found this one volume. The second journal was never located. How strange. My mother assumed it would turn up eventually. You know how things are after someone passes. There's so much to sort through, things get misplaced. But it never did. My mother searched periodically over the years, but the second journal seemed to have vanished. Margaret closed the first journal gently, as if apologising to it for the loss of its companion. When my mother died last year, I inherited her house. I've been slowly going through everything, and I've been searching specifically for that second journal, but there's no trace of it. Perhaps your grandmother never actually created a second volume, Clara suggested gently. I thought of that, but my mother was quite clear. She'd seen both journals, held them, looked through them. She said the second one was similar to this one, green cloth binding, filled with grandmother's handwriting. And there's evidence in this journal too. Margaret opened to near the end of the book. The entries stopped abruptly in December 1945, with a good 20 pages still blank. On the last page with writing, there was a note in the margin. Continued in volume 2. So she definitely intended a second volume at least, Clara said. And according to my mother, that second volume existed. She remembered specific entries from it. Grandmother had developed some particularly effective remedies in her later years, had refined her techniques. My mother said the second journal was full of valuable information. But your mother didn't remember specifically where it was kept. Margaret shook her head. She was only a teenager when Grandmother died. She remembered seeing the journals on the shelf in Grandmother's sitting room, but after the death, everything was packed up, moved, redistributed. The house was sold. Things scattered to various family members. And you've reached out to other family members? What's left of them? Yes. I'm an only child. My mother was an only child. Grandmother had one sister, but she died years ago, and her children don't remember anything about the journals. There were a few cousins who inherited items from Grandmother's house, but none of them have the journal. Clara considered the problem. A missing journal, last seen over 50 years ago, possibly lost in the chaos after someone's death. It could be anywhere. Could have been thrown away by accident. Could be mouldering in someone's attic. Could have been donated to a charity shop decades ago. And yet... Why bring this to me? Clara asked. Not that I'm not happy to help, but what made you think of asking me specifically? Margaret smiled slightly. Beatrice told me about the garden book, about how you helped Eleanor Hartwell find something that had been lost in her family for generations. She said you have a knack for this sort of thing, for finding lost things, connecting pieces of history. I don't know about a knack, Clara said modestly, but I do enjoy a gentle puzzle, and I'd be honoured to help if I can, though I'm not sure where we'd even begin. I have one lead, Margaret said. When I moved to Ivy Cottage, I learned something interesting from the estate agent. The cottage had been owned by the Henderson family for 80 years, but before that, from the 1890s through the 1940s, it was owned by the Thornbury family. Clara felt a spark of excitement. Your family? My grandmother's family. She grew up in Ivy Cottage. When she married my grandfather, they moved to Yorkshire, but she'd lived here in Willowbrook until she was in her 20s. So her gardens, the ones documented in this journal, were here, in the garden behind Ivy Cottage. My grandmother's herb beds, her vegetable plots, everything she wrote about in this journal. It all happened right here in Willowbrook. Clara sat back, her mind racing. That's quite a coincidence. You retiring to the exact cottage your grandmother grew up in. It didn't feel like coincidence when I learned about it, Margaret said softly. It felt like coming home, like being called back to something important. And you think the missing journal might be here, in the cottage? I don't know. It seems far-fetched. The house has been owned by other families for 80 years. If the journal was left behind, surely someone would have found it by now. But still... She trailed off, looking uncertain. But still, it's worth looking, Clara finished for her. Because where else do you have to look? Exactly. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. The rain continued its gentle drumming on the windows. The fire crackled softly. Marmalade purred from his cushion. When would you like to start searching? Clara asked. Margaret looked surprised. You'll help? Of course. I find I can't resist a good mystery, even a small one like this. And I'd love to see Ivy Cottage again. Mrs. Henderson rarely had visitors in her later years. Would this afternoon suit? I know it's terribly short notice. Clara considered her schedule. Wednesday afternoons were traditionally quiet at the Honeyed Leaf, and she had to admit she was thoroughly intrigued by this mystery. A missing journal, a house with history, the connection to gardens and herbs. It was exactly the sort of puzzle that appealed to her. This afternoon would be perfect, she said. Shall we say 2 o'clock? That gives me time to handle the lunch crowd and close up properly. Wonderful. Margaret finished her tea and stood. Thank you, Clara. I know this is probably a wild goose chase, but I'd like to try. That journal represents the last years of my grandmother's gardening knowledge. It feels important to find it if we can. After Margaret left, Clara cleared the table and found herself smiling. Another mystery, another search for something lost. It seemed to be becoming a pattern in her life, and she discovered she rather liked it. Beatrice would probably say she was developing a reputation as Willowbrook's finder of lost things. The thought was amusing, but also rather pleasant. Clara moved to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked village. Somewhere out there, possibly very close by, was a lost journal full of gardening wisdom. Knowledge that had been missing for decades, waiting to be rediscovered. She could hardly wait to begin searching. Chapter 2. Ivy Cottage. The rain had eased to a light mist by the time Clara walked down to Ivy Cottage that afternoon. She'd left the Honeyed Leaf in the capable paws of Marmalade, who had barely opened one eye when she told him she was leaving early. The path to Ivy Cottage led past the church and down a narrow lane that followed the stream. This was one of the oldest parts of Willowbrook, where the cottages were centuries old, built of the same golden stone as the church, with thick walls and small windows. Ivy Cottage sat at the end of the lane, partially hidden behind an ancient oak tree. The cottage lived up to its name. Ivy covered much of the front wall, though it had been neatly trimmed away from the windows and door. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows despite the grey afternoon. Margaret answered the door almost immediately, wearing gardening trousers and a thick jumper. Come in, she said warmly. I've made tea. Thought we'd need fortification for our search. The interior of the cottage was cosy and surprisingly spacious. The front door opened directly into a sitting room with exposed beams and a large fireplace where a fire crackled cheerfully. The furniture was an eclectic mix of old and new, comfortable rather than matching. I'm still settling in, Margaret said, following Clara's gaze. Most of this is furniture from my Leeds flat, but some pieces came from my mother's house. That bookcase was my grandmother's, actually. The bookcase in question was a beautiful piece, oak with glass doors, filled with books about plants and gardening. On top of it sat a collection of small pots containing various herbs, clearly cuttings Margaret was propagating. Rosemary, lavender and thyme, Margaret said, noticing Clara's interest. Starting an herb garden for next year. The garden here is rather overgrown. Mrs. Henderson apparently couldn't manage it in her later years. But the bones are good. I can see where the old beds were. She led Clara through to a small kitchen where a teapot sat waiting, along with a plate of biscuits. They settled at the kitchen table, which overlooked the back garden through a large window. The garden was indeed overgrown, but Clara could see what Margaret meant about the bones. Through the tangle of weeds and overgrown shrubs, there were clear signs of structure. Stone paths, the remains of raised beds, what looked like an old herb garden laid out in a geometric pattern. My grandmother's garden, Margaret said softly, looking out at it. When I first saw this place, before I knew the history, I was drawn to the garden. It felt right somehow. Then when the estate agent told me about the Thornbury family connection, everything made sense. It must be remarkable living where your grandmother lived. It is. Sometimes I stand at this window and try to imagine her here, young, tending her plants, gathering herbs. She would have stood right here, looked out at this same view. Clara sipped her tea, giving Margaret a moment with her thoughts. Then she asked gently, "Where would you like to start searching?" Margaret seemed to shake herself out of her reverie. Right, the search. I thought we'd start with the obvious places, anywhere you might store books or papers. I've already looked through most of the cottage, but as I said, perhaps fresh eyes will spot something I've missed. They began systematically. The sitting room first, checking behind and underneath the furniture, looking in drawers and cupboards, examining the bookcase thoroughly to see if anything might be hidden behind the books or tucked between them. "It's a long shot, I know," Margaret said as they searched. "If the journal was simply left here when the family moved, surely the Hendersons would have found it decades ago." "Unless it was hidden," Clara suggested. "Not deliberately hidden, necessarily, but tucked away somewhere unusual. People put things in odd places sometimes." They moved upstairs, where 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom occupied the upper floor. Margaret had set up the larger bedroom as her own, while the smaller one served as a combined guest room and office. The rooms yielded nothing. No hidden journals tucked into drawers, no forgotten papers in wardrobes, no mysterious boxes in the corners. Back downstairs, they checked the kitchen cupboards, the space under the stairs, even the small pantry. Nothing. "There's the attic," Margaret said, looking up at the ceiling hatch in the upper hallway. "But I've been up there twice. It's mostly empty. The Hendersons seem to have cleared it out before the estate sale." "Still, we should check," Clara said. Margaret fetched a pole with a hook on the end from her bedroom and used it to pull down the attic ladder. The wooden steps unfolded with a creak, releasing a drift of dust and the musty smell of old spaces. Clara climbed up first, emerging into a dim space under the eaves. Margaret followed, switching on a bare bulb that hung from a beam. The attic was indeed mostly empty. The floorboards were bare, except for a few cardboard boxes in one corner and some old picture frames stacked against the wall. The space felt hollow, echoing their footsteps. "See what I mean?" Margaret said. "The Hendersons must have cleared everything out." But Clara was already moving toward the boxes. "Let's check these at least." The boxes contained what looked like Christmas decorations and some old linens, nothing remotely like a journal. The picture frames held faded photographs of people Margaret didn't recognise, presumably Henderson family members. Clara walked slowly around the perimeter of the attic, running her hand along the walls, looking for anything unusual. Old houses sometimes had hidden nooks, false walls, spaces where things could be tucked away. Nothing. As they descended the ladder, Clara felt a small pang of disappointment. She'd been hoping for a quick discovery, a moment of triumph. But mysteries, even gentle ones, rarely solved themselves that easily. Back in the sitting room, Margaret made fresh tea while Clara looked around with new eyes. If the journal wasn't in any obvious storage place, where might it be? Where would someone put something they wanted to keep safe? Or where might something simply get lost? "Tell me about your grandmother," Clara said as Margaret returned with the tea. "What was she like?" Margaret settled into her chair, a distant look in her eyes. "I only knew her for 12 years, but I remember her vividly. She was practical, capable, no nonsense, but not unkind. She had hands that were always busy, gardening, cooking, mending. She didn't believe in idleness." "Was she secretive? Might she have deliberately hidden the journal?" "I don't think so. My mother said the journals were kept openly on a shelf. Grandmother was proud of her record-keeping, wanted to pass it on. If anything, she was the opposite of secretive. She wanted her knowledge shared." Clara sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Then perhaps the journal was simply misplaced during the move. When did your grandparents leave Willowbrook?" 1942. My grandfather got a job opportunity in Yorkshire. They packed up and moved quite suddenly, according to family stories. The war was on, things were unsettled. A hasty move during wartime," Clara mused. "Things could easily have been left behind accidentally." "That's what I keep thinking. Maybe the journal was packed in the wrong box, or put somewhere safe and then forgotten in the rush of moving. And if it was left behind, the new owners might have found it and..." Clara trailed off. "Thrown it away, most likely," Margaret finished sadly. "Why would strangers keep someone else's gardening notes?" "Unless they were gardeners themselves," Clara said. "Who bought the cottage after your grandparents left?" "The Henderson family. Thomas and Mary Henderson. They lived here until Thomas died in the 1980s, then Mary stayed on alone until she passed away last year." Did the Hendersons garden? Margaret brightened slightly. I don't know. That's a good question. The estate agent mentioned that Mrs. Henderson had loved her garden in earlier years, but I don't know any details. Then perhaps we should find out more about the Hendersons, Clara suggested. If they kept the journal, there might be records of it, and even if they didn't keep it, they might have mentioned finding it to someone. But who would remember after all these years? Clara smiled. In a village like Willowbrook, someone will remember. Someone always does. They decided to start their inquiries the next day. Margaret needed to visit the post office anyway, and the post office was where village information tended to flow. Meanwhile, Clara would talk to Beatrice at the library. If anyone had records or memories of the Henderson family, it would be Beatrice. As Clara walked back to the honeyed leaf through the misty afternoon, she found herself thinking about the mystery. A journal, missing for decades. A hasty wartime move. A cottage that had passed through different hands. It was possible the journal was simply gone, lost forever. But Clara didn't think so. She had a feeling about this, a sense that the journal was findable. It was just a matter of looking in the right places, asking the right questions. Back at the shop, she found a note had been slipped under the door. It was from Eleanor Hartwell, written in her elegant script. Dear Clara, Sophie and I are having tea tomorrow afternoon at 4. Would you like to join us? Eleanor. Clara smiled. Perfect timing. Eleanor had lived in Willowbrook her entire life. If anyone would remember the Hendersons and their garden, it would be Eleanor. Chapter 3. Village Memories. Thursday morning dawned clear and bright, the rain having passed through completely. Clara opened the honeyed leaf to find several customers already waiting outside, drawn by the promise of sunshine after the grey day before. Mrs. Pembroke was first through the door, as always. Lovely morning, though I must say I enjoyed yesterday's rain. Very cosy. It was perfect tea-drinking weather, Clara agreed. I saw you walking toward Ivy Cottage yesterday afternoon, Mrs. Pembroke said casually, settling at her table. Have you met Dr. Thornbury? Lovely woman, very knowledgeable about plants. Clara had learned that in Willowbrook, very little went unnoticed. Yes, we had tea. She's settling in nicely, I think. Such a coincidence, her ending up in that cottage. Did she tell you about the connection? She did mention her grandmother had lived there. The Thornbury family, yes. Before my time, of course, but my mother remembered them. Said the wife, I forget her name, had the most marvellous garden. Grew everything, knew all about herbs and remedies. People used to come to her for advice about plants. Clara's interest sharpened. Do you know anything about what happened when they moved away? Not really, dear. It was wartime, lots of people were moving around. The Hendersons bought the cottage, I believe. They were here for decades. After Mrs. Pembroke had been served, Clara spent the morning thinking about how to approach her inquiries. She needed to learn more about the Henderson family, particularly whether they'd had any interest in gardening, whether they might have found and kept an old journal. Around 11, Sophie Hartwell appeared at the door, her usual cheerful self. Morning, Clara. Just wanted to confirm you're coming for tea at Aunt Eleanor's this afternoon. I am, thank you. I'm looking forward to it. Excellent. Fair warning, Aunt Eleanor is in full gardening mode. She's been working on her autumn planting all week and will probably talk your ear off about bulbs and soil preparation. Clara laughed. I don't mind at all. Actually, I'm hoping Eleanor might help me with something. Do you remember the Henderson family? They lived in Ivy Cottage. Sophie thought for a moment. The name sounds familiar, but I don't think I ever met them. Why? Clara explained about Margaret and the missing journal, keeping the details brief. Sophie's face lit up with interest. Another lost document? How exciting! You're becoming quite the historical detective, Clara. Hardly. I'm just curious and lucky enough to have good friends who are patient with my questions. Well, Aunt Eleanor definitely knew the Hendersons. She knows everyone. She'll be able to help, I'm sure. After Sophie left, Clara closed the shop for her lunch break and walked to the library. Beatrice was at the front desk, cataloguing a stack of new books. Clara! Perfect timing. I was just thinking about you. Were you? Why? Margaret Thornbury stopped by this morning. She mentioned you're helping her look for her grandmother's missing journal. She asked if I could check our local history archives for any mention of the Henderson family. That's exactly what I was coming to ask you about, Clara said. What did you find? Come to the back room. I've pulled a few things that might be useful. In the library's research room, Beatrice had laid out several items on the table. Local history books, old photographs, and what looked like a collection of newspaper clippings. The Hendersons were quite prominent in the village, Beatrice explained. Thomas Henderson was on the parish council for years. His wife, Mary, was very active in the garden society, and here's the interesting bit. She won several prizes for her herb garden in the 1950s and 60s. Clara felt a surge of excitement. Her herb garden? Yes, look at this. Beatrice showed her a newspaper clipping from 1957. It was a photograph of a village fete, and in the foreground stood a woman holding a ribbon and trophy. The caption read, "Mary Henderson with her first place prize for Best Herb Garden, Willowbrook Autumn Fete." So she was a serious gardener? Clara said. Very serious. There are multiple mentions of her over the years. She gave talks on herb gardening, demonstrated drying techniques, judged competitions. She was quite the expert. Then she would have appreciated the journal if she'd found it, Clara said slowly. She might have kept it, used it, learned from it. That's what I thought too. Beatrice pulled out another item, a handwritten list. I found this in a donation box from the Henderson estate sale. It's a list of books that were donated to the library after Mary died. I was hoping the journal might be among them. Clara scanned the list. Garden encyclopedias, herb guides, cookbooks, but nothing that sounded like a personal journal. No luck there, Beatrice said. But it doesn't mean the journal wasn't in the house. Estate sales are chaotic. Things get overlooked, end up in the wrong boxes, get sold to dealers. Did anyone local buy much from the sale? Several people. Let me think. Emma from the bookshop bought some books. Old Tom Fletcher bought some garden tools, and I believe Eleanor bought a few items for the church jumble. Clara made mental notes. I'm seeing Eleanor this afternoon, I'll ask her. Good. And Margaret asked if she could look through our garden club records. They go back to the 1920s. I told her she's welcome to come in any time. Clara thanked Beatrice and walked back to the honeyed leaf, her mind working through the information. Mary Henderson had been an accomplished herb gardener. She would have valued a journal full of gardening knowledge. If she'd found it, she would likely have kept it. But where was it now? The afternoon at Hartwell Manor was delightful. Eleanor had indeed been working in her garden, and she welcomed Clara with dirt on her hands and happiness in her eyes. Come see the autumn border, she said, leading Clara through the garden. I've just finished planting spring bulbs. 200 tulips, can you imagine? They walked through the garden, admiring Eleanor's work, discussing plants and planning. Sophie joined them with a tray of tea and biscuits, and they settled at a small table in the conservatory, surrounded by potted plants and the gentle warmth of the afternoon sun. Now then, Eleanor said once they were settled. Sophie mentioned you wanted to ask me about the Henderson family. They walked through the garden, admiring Eleanor's work, discussing plants and planning. Sophie joined them with a tray of tea and biscuits, and they settled at a small table in the conservatory, surrounded by potted plants and the gentle warmth of the afternoon sun. Now then, Eleanor said once they were settled. Sophie mentioned you wanted to ask me about the Henderson family. Clara explained about Margaret and the missing journal, about Mary Henderson's apparent expertise in herb gardening. Eleanor listened thoughtfully, sipping her tea. Mary Henderson, she said slowly. Yes, I remember her well. Lovely woman, very knowledgeable. She and I were both in the Garden Society for decades, though she was a generation older than me. She died just last year, must have been in her mid-90s. Did she ever mention finding any old documents or journals when she moved into Ivy Cottage? Not that I recall. But then that would have been in 1942, long before I knew her. She didn't move to Willowbrook until the early 50s, from what I remember of her stories. Clara frowned, confused. But I thought the Hendersons bought Ivy Cottage in 1942. Oh, they did. But Thomas Henderson bought it as an investment, I believe. They were living elsewhere at the time. They didn't actually move into Ivy Cottage themselves until later. This was new information. So, the cottage sat empty for years? Not empty, no. It was let out to tenants. Several different families, I think, over the years. The Hendersons only moved in themselves in... Eleanor paused, thinking. It must have been 1953 or thereabouts, when Thomas retired from his business in Birmingham, and they decided to settle in Willowbrook permanently. Clara's mind raced. If the cottage had been rented out to various tenants between 1942 and 1953, any of them could have found the journal. It could have been moved, sold, thrown away years before Mary Henderson ever lived there. Do you know anything about the tenants? Clara asked. Not much, I'm afraid. I was quite young in the 40s, but I remember my mother talking about evacuees being housed in several village cottages during the war. Ivy Cottage might have been one of them. Evacuees, Sophie said thoughtfully. Children from the cities, sent to the countryside for safety. Yes, London children mostly. They stayed with local families or in any available cottages. Eleanor refilled their teacups. Why does this matter? Because if someone found the journal during those years, we need to figure out who, Clara explained. It's a much longer chain of possibility than we thought. They discussed the problem for a while longer, but Eleanor couldn't remember specific details about the tenants. It had been too long ago, and she'd been too young to pay attention. As Clara walked home that evening, she felt both discouraged and energised. The mystery was more complicated than she'd thought, but that also meant there were more avenues to explore. Somewhere in the chain of people who'd lived in or visited Ivy Cottage over the decades, someone might remember something about an old garden journal. Back at the Honeyed Leaf, she found Margaret waiting outside, looking hopeful. Any luck? Margaret asked. Clara invited her in and made tea while she explained what she'd learned. Margaret listened, her expression shifting from hope to concern. So many people might have found it, Margaret said. How do we even begin to trace all of them? We start with what we can find out, Clara said practically. Beatrice mentioned the Garden Society records go back decades. Maybe there's something in there. And I think we should talk to some of the older villagers. Someone might remember stories about the cottage, about the tenants, about anything unusual. It seems like such a long shot. Perhaps, but we have one advantage. Clara poured the tea and smiled. If Mary Henderson became an expert herb gardener, she learned from somewhere. She might have learned from that journal. If we can trace her knowledge, her techniques, her particular approaches to herbs, we might find evidence of your grandmother's influence. Margaret's eyes widened. You're brilliant. If she used the journal, there might be records of it. References in her competition entries, mentions in her talks. Exactly. Your grandmother's knowledge might have survived, just not in the form we expected. They made plans to visit the library together the next day to go through the Garden Society records. Margaret left looking more hopeful than she had all day. Clara closed up the shop and climbed the stairs to her flat, feeling satisfied with the day's progress. The mystery was deepening, but she felt they were on the right track. Somewhere in the accumulated records of Willowbrook's gardening history, there would be traces of the missing journal. It was just a matter of patient, careful searching. Chapter 4. The Garden Society records Friday morning was busy at the Honeyed Leaf. Word had apparently spread about the autumn blend, and several customers specifically requested it. Clara found herself brewing pot after pot, pleased that her experiment was so well received. Around mid-morning, Margaret appeared with a large notebook under her arm. "Ready for our research expedition?" she asked. Clara had arranged to close the shop for a few hours. She left a note on the door directing regulars to return after 2 o'clock, grabbed her own notebook, and walked with Margaret to the library. Beatrice had set them up in the research room with several large boxes of materials. "Garden Society records from 1920 to 1990, she announced. "Minutes of meetings, competition records, event programmes, photographs, newspaper clippings. It's all fairly well organised, thankfully." "This is wonderful, Beatrice, thank you. I'll leave you to it. Call if you need anything." Clara and Margaret settled in and began systematically going through the materials. They started with the 1950s, when Mary Henderson first appeared in the records. The minutes of the Garden Society meetings were detailed, recording discussions of events, competitions and demonstrations. Mary Henderson's name appeared regularly, noted as giving presentations or judging herb garden competitions. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to an entry from 1956. Mary Henderson gave a talk titled Traditional Herb Garden Design. She demonstrated what they called period-appropriate planting techniques. Clara leaned over to read. "What does that mean, do you think?" Could mean she was using older methods she might have learned from an old journal. They continued searching. In 1958, there was a programme from the Summer Garden Tour listing Mary Henderson's garden as one of the featured stops. The description read, "Mrs. Henderson's herb garden showcases traditional varieties and historical growing methods, creating a living connection to the gardening practices of earlier generations." "Historical growing methods," Clara murmured. "That's suggestive." In a box of photographs from the 1960s, they found several images of Mary Henderson's garden. The herb beds were laid out in a geometric pattern, with clear labelling stakes for each variety. The plants looked healthy and abundant. Margaret stared at one photograph for a long moment. "This layout," she said slowly. "It's similar to my grandmother's designs in the first journal. Not identical, but the same principles. The spacing, the companion planting, the way the paths divide the beds." Clara compared the photograph to Margaret's grandmother's journal, which Margaret had brought along. There were indeed similarities in the overall approach and design philosophy. "It's not proof," Margaret said, "but it's suggestive. They worked through lunch, absorbed in the materials. The more they found, the more convinced Clara became that Mary Henderson had indeed been influenced by the missing journal." In a 1962 newspaper article about a herb garden competition, Mary was quoted saying, "I learned my craft from careful observation of traditional methods. The old ways often prove to be the best ways." "Learned from careful observation," Clara repeated. "She's being vague about her sources." "Maybe deliberately," Margaret said. "Perhaps she didn't want to admit she was using someone else's journal. Or perhaps she simply considered it absorbed knowledge by that point." Around 2:00, Clara needed to return to the shop, but Margaret stayed at the library, determined to continue going through the records. "I'll stop by the shop before you close," Margaret promised. "Let you know if I find anything else." The afternoon at the Honeyed Leaf was steady but not overwhelming. Clara served tea and thought about the mystery. They were building a circumstantial case that Mary Henderson had used the journal, but they still had no idea where it was now. As she was serving Mrs. Pembroke her afternoon tea, Clara had a thought. "Mrs. Pembroke, did you know Mary Henderson well?" "Fairly well, dear. We were both in the Women's Institute together for years." "Why?" "I'm helping Dr. Thornbury search for something that might have been at Ivy Cottage. I was wondering if you remember anything about Mrs. Henderson's interest in gardening." Mrs. Pembroke settled in happily for a gossip. "Oh, Mary was devoted to her garden. Spent every spare moment out there, right up until her health failed. She used to say her garden was her library. Everything she needed to know was growing right there." "Did she ever mention learning from books or journals?" "Not that I recall. She was quite secretive about her methods, actually. Proprietary, you might say. When people asked for advice, she'd give it, but she never quite explained where her knowledge came from. Some people thought she was being snobbish, but I always felt it was more that she didn't quite know how to explain. As if she'd absorbed the knowledge so completely that she couldn't separate it into teachable bits anymore." This was interesting. "What happened to her garden after she died?" "It fell into neglect, I'm afraid. Mary had no children, and her nephew who inherited the cottage wasn't interested in gardening. He lived in London, just wanted to sell it quickly. The garden went wild within a few months." "And her belongings? The contents of the house?" "There was an estate sale. I went, actually, though I didn't buy much. Just a few bits and pieces for the church jumble. Old Tom Fletcher bought most of the garden tools. Emma from the bookshop took the books." Clara made a mental note to talk to Emma. If Mary Henderson had kept the journal, it might have been mixed in with her other gardening books. When Margaret returned to the shop just before closing time, she looked tired but excited. "I found something," she said, pulling out her notebook. In the 1971 Garden Society records, there's a note about a special presentation Mary Henderson gave. It was called A Century of Village Gardening. She showed examples of gardening techniques from the 1800s through to modern times. "That's quite a scope," Clara said. "Yes, and according to the minutes, she brought along historical documents and journals to illustrate her points. The secretary noted that Mrs. Henderson's collection of period gardening materials was extensive and fascinating." "Historical documents and journals," Clara repeated. "Plural. So she had a collection." "Exactly. And if she had a collection, where is it now? None of that was in the estate sale inventory." They looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. "Her house," Clara said. "The journals might still be in Ivy Cottage, somewhere neither you nor the Hendersons found when they cleaned it out for sale." "But I've searched everywhere," Margaret protested. "Maybe not everywhere," Clara said thoughtfully. "Old cottages have secrets, hidden spaces, forgotten cupboards. Have you checked for false walls, under floorboards, in the garden?" Margaret's eyes widened. "The garden? We haven't searched the garden at all." "Then that's where we look next," Clara said decisively. "Tomorrow morning, if you're free, we'll give that garden a thorough investigation." They made plans to meet at Ivy Cottage at 9 o'clock the next morning. After Margaret left, Clara closed up the shop with a sense of anticipation. Tomorrow they would search the garden, and Clara had a good feeling about it. Old gardeners, she knew, often had little sheds, buried boxes, hidden caches where they kept their most precious items. If Mary Henderson had treasured that journal, if she'd wanted to keep it safe and close to her garden, she might have stored it somewhere outside. It was a theory, at least, and sometimes theories were all you needed to point you in the right direction. Chapter 5. The Garden Investigation. Saturday morning arrived with autumn sunshine and a crisp chill in the air. Clara dressed warmly, packed a flask of tea and some biscuits, and walked to Ivy Cottage feeling energised. Margaret met her at the gate, already dressed in Wellington boots and gardening gloves. "I've been up since dawn," Margaret admitted. "Too excited to sleep. I've been looking at the garden from every angle, trying to figure out where someone might hide something." The garden behind Ivy Cottage looked different in the morning light, less overgrown and more structured than Clara had initially thought. Now that she was really looking, she could see the intentional design underneath the neglect. "The herb garden was here," Margaret said, pointing to a section near the house where a raised bed structure was still visible under the weeds. "And this path would have led to a vegetable garden. There's what looks like an old cold frame over there, and that might be the remains of a compost area." They walked the perimeter slowly. The garden backed onto the stream, with a low stone wall marking the boundary. An old apple tree grew in one corner, gnarled and in need of pruning but still alive. A small stone shed sat near the house, its door hanging slightly ajar. "Let's start with the shed," Clara suggested. The shed was about 6 feet square, with a stone floor and wooden shelves along 2 walls. It smelled of earth and old wood, and contained the usual garden shed items: terracotta pots, hand tools, a few bags of what had once been fertiliser, but were now just hardened lumps. They searched methodically, behind pots, under shelves, in corners. The stone floor was solid, with no evidence of loose stones or hidden compartments. Nothing. "The cold frame next," Margaret said. The cold frame was an old-fashioned design, a wooden box with a glass top, sunk partly into the ground. It had been used for starting seedlings and protecting tender plants. The glass was broken now, and weeds grew through the frame. They cleared away the vegetation and examined the structure carefully. Margaret even dug around the perimeter, checking if anything might be buried underneath. Still nothing. By mid-morning, they'd searched every obvious structure in the garden. They'd checked under paving stones in the path, examined the stone wall for loose stones that might hide a cache, even investigated the base of the apple tree for any sign of buried items. They took a break, sitting on the back step of the cottage, drinking tea from Clara's flask. "Maybe this was a foolish idea," Margaret said, discouraged. "Maybe the journal isn't here at all. Or maybe we're looking for the wrong kind of hiding place," Clara said thoughtfully. She was gazing at the herb garden area, thinking about Mary Henderson and her secretive approach to her knowledge. If Mary considered the garden her library, as Mrs. Pembroke said, maybe she meant that literally. "What do you mean?" What if she kept the journal in the garden itself? Not buried, but stored somewhere she could access it easily while she worked. Somewhere weatherproof but convenient. They both looked around with fresh eyes. "The shed is too obvious," Margaret said. "We checked it thoroughly and there's no greenhouse or other building." Clara stood up and walked slowly through the garden again, trying to think like a gardener. Where would you keep something precious while you worked? Somewhere you could refer to it quickly, but where it would be protected from weather and soil. Her eye caught on something she hadn't noticed before. Near the herb garden, partially hidden by an overgrown lavender bush, there was a wooden structure built against the stone wall. It looked like a small bench with a hinged lid. "Margaret, what's that?" They pushed aside the lavender to get a better look. It was indeed a bench about 3 feet long, made of weathered wood that had once been painted green. The kind of garden seat where you could sit while working, with storage underneath for tools or supplies. Margaret tried to lift the lid, but it was stuck. They worked carefully, not wanting to break the old wood. Finally, with a bit of gentle prying, the lid came up. Inside was a wooden box, protected from the weather by the sealed bench. The box was approximately 18 inches square, made of cedar with a simple latch. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she reached for it. "Do you think—" "Open it," Clara said softly. Margaret opened the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth, were several items. A small trowel with an ornate handle, a packet of old seed packets, the colours faded but the images still visible, a pair of worn gardening gloves, and underneath it all, 2 green cloth-bound books. Margaret lifted out the books with trembling hands. The first was clearly old, its cover faded and worn. She opened it carefully. In familiar handwriting, the first page read, "Garden Journal, Volume 2, 1945-1968, Catherine Thornbury." Margaret made a small sound, halfway between a laugh and a sob. "It's here. It's actually here." The second book was newer, its cover in better condition. Margaret opened it and read the first page aloud. "Garden Journal, Mary Henderson, 1953-1980, compiled with deep gratitude to Catherine Thornbury, whose wisdom guides these pages." They sat there on the ground beside the bench, in the autumn sunshine, carefully turning pages. Margaret's grandmother's journal was indeed a continuation of the first volume. Detailed observations, sketches, recipes, notes about what worked and what didn't. And Mary Henderson's journal was extraordinary. She'd clearly studied Catherine Thornbury's work extensively and had built upon it, refining techniques, adding her own observations, but always acknowledging her source. One entry from 1955 read, "Used Mrs. Thornbury's method for drying mint today. She was absolutely correct about the temperature and darkness being crucial. The flavour is far superior to my previous attempts. How fortunate I was to find her journals in the garden shed when we moved here." "She found both journals," Clara said, reading over Margaret's shoulder. "And she treasured them, learned from them, but she kept them private, here in the garden where she worked." Margaret was carefully turning pages, tears streaming down her face. "She preserved my grandmother's knowledge, extended it, and then she kept them safe, hidden where anyone who truly cared about the garden would eventually find them." They spent another hour in the garden, reading through both journals. Mary Henderson's entries showed a deep respect for Catherine Thornbury's work. She referred to the older woman as her teacher, even though they'd never met. In one particularly touching entry from 1968, Mary had written, "Catherine Thornbury passed away this year, according to the death notice I found in the Yorkshire papers. I never had the chance to tell her how much her journals meant to me, how they transformed my understanding of gardening. I hope, wherever she is, she knows that her knowledge lives on, here in the garden she once tended. They're together now," Margaret said softly. "My grandmother's journals, both of them, and the journal of the woman who learned from her. It's perfect." Clara agreed. There was something deeply moving about this connection across time. 2 women who'd never met, linked by their love of plants and their commitment to preserving knowledge. They gathered up the journals and the other items from the box, handling everything with care. Inside the cottage, Margaret cleared a space on her kitchen table and laid everything out. I need to have these properly conserved, she said. But first, I want to read every word. Will you share them? Clara asked. Your dissertation research, I mean, and perhaps with the library? Absolutely. These journals are too valuable to keep hidden away. They're a record of women's knowledge, passed down and preserved. That's exactly what my research is about, and I'd love for them to be available to other gardeners, other researchers. They spent the rest of the morning at the kitchen table drinking tea and carefully examining the journals. Margaret made notes, took photographs, traced the progression of knowledge from Catherine Thornbury through Mary Henderson. Do you know what this means? Margaret said at one point. My grandmother's knowledge didn't die with her. It was passed on, preserved, used. She achieved exactly what she hoped for. Her work continued, helped people, made a difference. Clara thought about Agnes Hartwell and her garden book, about how Clara had helped revive that tradition. There seemed to be a pattern in Willowbrook, a tendency for lost knowledge to be found again, for traditions to be preserved. I think Willowbrook is good at remembering, Clara said. The village values its history, its traditions. Knowledge like this doesn't get lost here. It just waits to be rediscovered. Around noon, Margaret insisted on making them lunch. While she worked in the kitchen, Clara wandered back out to the garden. She looked at the herb beds, imagining Catherine Thornbury working here 80 years ago, and Mary Henderson working here more recently. Both women tending the same soil, growing the same herbs, connected by their shared love of plants. The garden was still overgrown, still in need of work, but it had good bones, as Eleanor would say. With care and attention, it could be beautiful again. I'm going to restore it, Margaret said, joining Clara in the garden. The herb garden, I mean, using my grandmother's designs and Mary Henderson's improvements. It'll be a living tribute to both of them. That's a wonderful idea, Clara said warmly. And perhaps once it's established, you could give tours or workshops, share what you're learning from the journals. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. They ate lunch in the cottage, making plans. Margaret would spend the next few weeks carefully reading through both journals, transcribing the most important sections, consulting with Beatrice about proper conservation. She'd begin planning the garden restoration, ordering seeds, preparing the soil. And I'm going to write about this for my thesis, Margaret said. This story of finding the journals, of how women's knowledge was preserved and passed on. It's a perfect case study. As Clara walked back to the honeyed leaf that afternoon, she felt deeply satisfied. Another mystery solved, another piece of history preserved. The missing journal had been found, and with it, a beautiful story of connection and continuity. The village green was busy with Saturday afternoon activity. Children playing, couples strolling, people going about their weekend errands. The same patterns of life that had played out here for centuries. Clara loved being part of it. Part of this community where the past lived alongside the present, where old knowledge was valued, where mysteries could be solved with patience and collaboration. She opened the shop to find several messages had been left under the door. One from Beatrice, asking for an update on the search. One from Eleanor, inviting Clara to tea next week. And one from Sophie, suggesting they start a village history group. Clara smiled at that last one. A history group. It was a lovely idea. There were clearly stories all over Willowbrook, waiting to be discovered, knowledge waiting to be preserved. That evening, after closing the shop, Clara made herself a cup of her autumn blend and settled into her favourite chair by the window. Marmalade jumped into her lap, purring his contentment. She thought about Catherine Thornbury, working in her garden at Ivy Cottage decades ago, carefully recording her observations. She'd hoped her knowledge would be passed on, would help others. And it had. Through her journals, through Mary Henderson's dedication, through Margaret's rediscovery, that knowledge would continue to flow forward. It was a legacy, not grand or dramatic, but real and lasting, the kind of legacy that mattered. Clara sipped her tea and watched the evening settle over the village. Lights coming on in windows, people heading home for dinner, the peaceful transition from day to night. Tomorrow she would open the shop again. There would be customers to serve, conversations to have, perhaps even new mysteries to discover. Life in Willowbrook continued its gentle rhythm, and Clara was grateful to be part of it. Marmalade shifted in her lap, settling more comfortably. Clara scratched behind his ears and he purred louder. "You know," she told him, "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Marmalade, having no doubt about his own place in the world, simply purred his agreement. Chapter 6. Sharing the Discovery. The following week brought a pleasant routine back to the honeyed leaf. Clara served her regulars, experimented with a new winter blend using orange peel and cardamom, and found herself thinking often about the discovered journals. Margaret had stopped by several times, each visit bringing new excitement about something she'd read. The journals were proving to be even more valuable than she'd hoped, full of detailed observations and careful experiments. On Wednesday afternoon, Margaret arrived with a carefully wrapped package. "I've had copies made," she announced. "Full photographic reproductions of both journals. One set for the library archives, one for me to work with, and one for you." "For me?" Clara was surprised. "Of course, you helped find them. And besides, you'll appreciate them. There are recipes for tisanes and herbal preparations, detailed notes on drying and preserving herbs. It's right up your alley." Clara accepted the package gratefully. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll treasure these. And I have more news. The university press is interested in publishing my thesis as a book. They want to include the story of finding the journals, photographs from them, the whole narrative of how women's gardening knowledge was preserved and transmitted. It's going to be a real book, Clara." "That's wonderful. Congratulations." "I couldn't have done it without you. Without Willowbrook, really. This whole place has become part of my research, part of my story." That evening, Clara sat down with the reproductions of the journals. She started with Catherine Thornbury's second volume, reading through the entries from 1945 onward. Catherine's voice came through clearly in her writing, practical, observant, with occasional flashes of dry humour. She wrote about the challenges of gardening during wartime rationing, about making do with limited resources, about the satisfaction of growing food and medicine for her family and neighbours. One entry from 1947 caught Clara's attention. "Made a new tisane today, combining lemon balm with chamomile and a touch of rose. My neighbour Mrs. Fletcher has been troubled with nerves since her son returned from the war. She says this blend helps her sleep, calms her worries. I'm pleased to be able to offer some comfort during these difficult times. The war may be over, but healing takes longer than victory." Clara felt a lump in her throat. Catherine Thornbury had understood something fundamental about the work she was doing. It wasn't just about plants or recipes. It was about caring for people, about offering comfort through small acts of kindness. It was exactly what Clara tried to do at the honeyed leaf. She continued reading, fascinated by Catherine's observations about different herbs, her experiments with drying times and preparation methods. Many of her techniques were still used today, though Catherine had been working them out through trial and error, careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. When Clara moved on to Mary Henderson's journal, she found a different voice but a similar dedication. Mary had approached Catherine's journals like a student approaches a master's work, studying each entry, trying the methods, adding her own observations. Mary's entries were more technical, more analytical. She cross-referenced Catherine's observations with modern gardening books, noted when scientific research confirmed traditional knowledge, explained the botanical reasons behind certain techniques. Together, the two journals created a remarkable record. Catherine's empirical wisdom combined with Mary's scientific understanding. Traditional knowledge meeting modern analysis. Clara read late into the night, making her own notes, thinking about how she might apply some of these techniques to her tea blending. There were preparation methods she'd never considered, combinations she wanted to try. When she finally went to bed, her mind was full of plants and possibilities. She dreamed of gardens, of women working with herbs across centuries, their knowledge flowing forward like a stream, sometimes hidden but never truly lost. The next morning, Beatrice appeared at the honeyed leaf just as Clara was opening. "I've been reading the journal copies Margaret gave to the library," Beatrice announced. "They're extraordinary. I'm thinking we should do an exhibition." "An exhibition?" "Yes, about women's knowledge in Willowbrook. We could feature the Hartwell Garden Book and the Thornbury journals, show how this knowledge was preserved and passed down. We could include photographs of the gardens, samples of herbs, maybe even offer tisane tastings." Clara's face lit up. "Beatrice, that's brilliant. I thought you'd like it, and I was hoping you'd help. You could handle the tisane portion. Perhaps recreate some of the recipes from the journals. I would love to. They spent the next hour planning. The exhibition would run for a month, starting in early December. They'd set up displays in the library's community room, invite local schools to visit, hold weekend workshops on herb gardening and traditional remedies. Eleanor agreed to loan the garden book for the exhibition. Margaret was thrilled to have her grandmother's work featured. Sophie volunteered to create educational materials about the historical context. The exhibition began to take shape over the following weeks. Clara worked closely with Beatrice, selecting recipes from the journals to recreate. She made Catherine Thornbury's nervousness blend, Mary Henderson's winter warming tea, and several other preparations, carefully following the historical instructions. She also experimented with creating informational cards for each tisane, explaining the traditional uses of the herbs, the historical context, and how the recipes had been preserved. It was educational but accessible, exactly the tone she wanted. Mrs. Pembroke became an unexpected helper, remembering stories about Mary Henderson that added colour to the exhibition. Old Tom Fletcher donated photographs of Ivy Cottage's garden from the 1960s. Emma from the bookshop created a display of historical gardening books that complemented the journals. The whole village seemed to get involved, excited about celebrating this piece of local history. On the day before the exhibition opening, Clara stood in the library's community room, looking at what they'd created. Display cases held the precious journals, opened to particularly beautiful pages. Photographs showed the gardens past and present. Pressed flowers and herbs were mounted under glass. And in one corner, Clara had set up a small tasting area where visitors could sample the historical tisanes. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, appearing beside Clara. "Catherine Thornbury and Mary Henderson would be proud." "I hope so," Clara said. "I hope we're honouring their work properly." "You are. This exhibition shows that what they did mattered, that their knowledge has value. That's all anyone really wants, to know their work matters." The exhibition opening was held on a Saturday afternoon in early December. Despite the cold weather, dozens of people turned out. Some were Garden Society members, interested in the gardening history. Others were simply curious villagers, drawn by the promise of an interesting story. Margaret gave a short talk about finding the journals, about her grandmother's work, and Mary Henderson's dedication to preserving it. She spoke movingly about the importance of recognising women's contributions to botanical knowledge, about how much wisdom had been lost or dismissed over the centuries, simply because it came from women working in domestic spaces rather than official institutions. But sometimes, Margaret concluded, that knowledge survives. Sometimes it's preserved by people who recognise its value. Sometimes it's found again by people who care enough to search. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it's celebrated by a community that understands what it means. Thank you, Willowbrook, for being that community. There was genuine applause. People moved through the exhibition, reading the displays, examining the journals, tasting the historical tisanes. Clara was kept busy at the tasting station, explaining the blends, answering questions about herbs and their uses. Mrs. Pembroke tried the nervousness blend and declared it even better than her usual chamomile. "There's something about knowing the history," she said. "It makes it taste more meaningful." Clara understood what she meant. The tisanes weren't just beverages. They were connections to the past, to the women who'd created them, to the traditions they represented. As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself in conversation with a young woman she didn't recognise. The woman was perhaps in her late 20s, with an earnest expression and a notebook in her hand. "I'm Rachel," she introduced herself. "I'm a grad student at Oxford studying ethnobotany. Dr. Thornbury told me about this exhibition. This is exactly the kind of material I'm researching." They talked for nearly an hour about the journals, about traditional knowledge, about how to preserve and document this kind of wisdom. Rachel was particularly interested in the preparation methods, the careful observations about timing and technique. "This is the kind of knowledge that's being lost," Rachel said. "Not because it's not valuable, but because it's not recognised as valid knowledge. It's dismissed as folk wisdom or old wives' tales. But look at these journals. This is rigorous, empirical work. These women were scientists, even if they weren't recognised as such." "That's what we wanted to show," Clara said. "You've succeeded. This exhibition is important. Would you mind if I wrote about it? For an academic journal I'm contributing to." "Of course not. We'd be honoured." The exhibition ran for a month, and in that time it brought an unexpected stream of visitors to Willowbrook. Academic researchers came to examine the journals. Garden enthusiasts came to see the photographs and read about the techniques. School groups came for educational visits. But more than that, it sparked conversations in the village about history and knowledge, about what's worth preserving and how to do it. Several older villagers came forward with their own family recipes and traditions, wanting to share them before they were lost. Sophie started the village history group she'd suggested, and it quickly filled with enthusiastic members. They began documenting local history, recording oral interviews with older residents, preserving photographs and documents. Willowbrook was remembering itself, celebrating its own past, ensuring that knowledge and stories wouldn't be lost to time. For Clara, the exhibition represented something profound. It was about more than just finding a lost journal. It was about recognising the value in what had been dismissed or overlooked. It was about preserving knowledge not for its own sake, but because that knowledge represented care, dedication and love passed down through generations. That was the real magic of Willowbrook, Clara thought. Not that mysteries existed to be solved, but that people cared enough to solve them. That knowledge mattered enough to preserve. That history was valued, not as a dusty record of the past, but as a living connection to the present.